Good afternoon. I'm Christy van der Westhuizen. I'm an associate professor at the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy. And let me hand over to our Vice Chancellor at Nelson Mandela University, Professor Sibongile Mutwa, to do our welcome and introductions this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Christy, and to all our guests for this afternoon and our attendees. And it is my pleasure to have an opportunity to open this colloquium, this symposium this afternoon. I want to greet the Ambassador Nozipho January Badil, who also happened to be our Chair of Council at our university, Dr. Geraldine Fraser Muleketi, the Chancellor of our university, Professor Bani Pityana, Professor Shirley N. Tate, Professor Andre Kiet, the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Engagement and Transformation, and other Deputy Vice Chancellors of our university and beyond that are attending this event. Prof. Christy van der Westhuizen, esteemed colleagues, our beloved students, all who are joining us from various parts of our country, continent, and further afield. I welcome all of you most warmly. Nelson Mandela University, via collaboration between the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy, CANRAD, the Office of the Deputy Vice Chancellor, Engagement and Transformation, and the Chair in Critical Studies in Higher Education Transformation, is proud to be hosting this symposium as we continue our journey of engagement and reflection on what remains one of the central and perennial preoccupations of our world, continent, and country, that is race and racism. Recent world events, including the senseless and heartless killings of Black males under the guise of policing, have raised global anger and disgust, prompting widespread protests, which have manifested in movements such as Black Lives Matter. While we laud this action, accusations have been leveled by other activists and scholars that the Black Lives Matter movement has focused global attention on the North, hijacking, if you will, the global agenda against racism, and in so doing, possibly detracting from racism being perpetuated across the world, as well as the struggles of victims for similar momentum and publicity in regard to their continued suffering and injustice. We need to look no further than our own shores for confirmation of this phenomenon. At a time when we're celebrating Women's Month here in South Africa, we're painfully reminded that celebration seems to be an obscene choice of word, given the ongoing slaughter of predominantly Black women in our country. And we pause just for a moment to honor the memory of Nosicelo Mthebeni, a 23 years old, a fourth-year LLB student from the University of Fort Hare, who is our most recent victim of this national scourge. This latest tragedy is particularly poignant when one states that in our Vision 2030 as the University, Nelson Mandela, we have committed to combating racism, amongst other forms of prejudice and discrimination. The pathologization of all that is Africa and African that permeates our dominant discourses is underlined in Vision 2030 as a central challenge for us as the university to confront. In this context and in pursuit of the values of social justice and equality in Vision 2030 of the university, and to contribute to the advancement of racial justice and global action against racism, we undertook to host this symposium to mark the 20th anniversary of the United Nations World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, through the theme Challenges and Advances in the Global Fight Against Racism. Our symposium, colleagues, aims to do the following. Firstly, to critically engage on enduring formations of race and racism as addressed at that World Conference, drawing on inputs by role players with first-hand experience of having participated in that conference. Secondly, we want to situate the critiques of race and racism within global and national landscapes. Thirdly, we would like to take stock of advances, challenges, and setbacks in bringing the World Conference Against Racism Declaration to fruition. Finally, we would like in this symposium to create a timely platform for the advancement of anti-racist knowledges and activism towards decolonization and the crafting of new horizons of humanization. Ladies and gentlemen and colleagues, there are as many permutations of racism as there are racists and victims of racism, and almost all of them are grounded in the baser aspects of our so-called humanity: power and exploitation, fear, greed, and hatred, to name just a few. These drive the phenomenon of othering and the reduction of human beings to biological or cultural types, which in turn reduce human diversity to essential categories while justifying inequalities between them. At the same time, and in that process, racism perpetuates, justifies, and normalizes notions of white superiority and supremacy, which manifest in extreme forms of human exploitation, such as slavery, genocide, human trafficking, and the denial of civil and political rights to immigrant minorities. And as we know, most forms of racism, prejudice are politically and of racial prejudice are politically and systematically entrenched, manipulated, and reinforced in such a way as to maintain the status quo of dominance and superiority. Old historical and new ideas, beliefs, and traditions continue to mystify and justify discrimination, inequality, and exploitation, reinforcing coloniality as a world system. We have first-hand evidence of this in our own country, which, despite democracy and a constitution that guarantees equal rights, continues to bear the burden of precisely this legacy of entrenched, systematic, and physical and psychological discrimination, as well as intergenerational trauma. Racism remains a challenge that is continuously confronted at the everyday level within institutions and also in the national discourse, despite evidence of legal measures to confront racism in South Africa and beyond. Racism has proven particularly intractable at educational institutions, including our own, by the way, ranging from schools to universities, partly in response to institutionalized and everyday racisms. University students embarked on Rhodes Must Fall and Related Fees Must Fall protests in 2015 and 2016, while more latterly, most institutions have embarked on decoloniality programs as part of the reclamation of our authentically African identities and practice. I have to say that I am very proud of the outstanding work that our university is doing in this regard. So how are we faring 20 years after the United Nations World Conference Against Racism was held on the 30th of August to the 8th of September 2001 in Durban, here in South Africa? The controversial withdrawal from the conference on the 3rd of September 2001 by the delegates from the USA and Israel came as a result of their denunciation of the condemnation of Israel in a proposed conference declaration. And indeed, we might ask how much that sentiment has changed since 2001. The UN Human Rights Office was mandated in June 2020 by Human Rights Council Resolution 43/1 in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, which I mentioned earlier, in the United States, to produce a comprehensive report on systemic racisms, violations of international human rights law against Africans and people of African descent by law enforcement agencies, government responses to anti-racism and peaceful protests, as well as accountability and redress for victims. The report found that system-wide, disproportionate and discriminatory impacts on people of African descent in their encounters with law enforcement and the criminal justice system in some states still exist, and recognizes, and I quote, long overdue need to confront the legacies of enslavement, the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans and colonialism, and to seek reparatory justice, close quote. Recommendations from the report include the need for the Human Rights Council to either establish a specific time-bound mechanism or strengthen an existing mechanism to advance racial justice and equality in the context of law enforcement in all parts of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, as I move to conclude, the scope of the challenges that face us is enormous, and I hope that as we engage on the multitude of topics in this symposium this afternoon, that we will take heart and find some deliberate forms of action for resolutions as a country, but also as a university dedicated to the eradication of all forms of racism and social injustice. I am at this stage, therefore, going to again introduce Prof. van der Westhuizen and Christie, the critical whiteness scholar, associate professor at the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy, Nelson Mandela University, and a former political correspondent reporting on that conference in 2001, who will be our moderator this afternoon. And as well as Prof. Kiet, our Deputy Vice Chancellor, who will offer some reflections and vote of thanks at the end. You are most welcome, colleagues and ladies and gentlemen. It is now my pleasure to hand over to you, Christie. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Mutwa, for those important words. As Professor Mutwa has alerted us to, the UN World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia and Related Intolerance was held almost exactly 20 years ago, from the 30th of August to 8 September 2001, here in South Africa, in Durban. The aim with the conference has been already highlighted by Professor Mutwa in her introduction to our talk today. And as she has also mentioned, at the time, the conference was overshadowed by the withdrawal of the United States and Israel. Of equal importance, which has fallen by the wayside, it seems, is what some Caribbean scholars regard as a geopolitical shift at the time, when African states, by and large, did not support Caribbean states' stance that reparations for the devastation of slavery should have been a binding resolution of the conference. But the declaration with its related program of action was still adopted, as Professor Mutwa has also told us, and it encompasses a wide range of aspects. Here in South Africa, we've actually adopted a national action plan to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia and related intolerance. But only very recently, and civil society organizations have been very critical about how long it has taken for this plan to be formulated. While the post-apartheid dispensation involves a constitutional policy and legislative infrastructure directed at overturning the colonial and apartheid legacies of discrimination and exploitation, we know as South Africans that we continue to battle these historical patterns of race inequality, which also happen at the everyday level. We are lucky to have with us today a number of notables who were role players at the conference in 2001. Ambassador January Baldwin served on the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia and Related Intolerance, for 12 years after the conference. Dr. Fraser Molokai was a cabinet minister at the time and active in the South African delegation to the conference. Dr. Pityana was a former chairperson of the South African Human Rights Commission and or is a former chairperson of the Human Rights Commission. And at the time, he was the designated spokesperson for national institutions at the conference. And we're also very lucky to have Professor Shirley-Ann Tait with us, whose comprehensive and expansive work addresses the question of global racism, which is where we want to take the conversation today. So we will use the Durban conference as a springboard to interrogate racism, to understand how and why it continues to rage across the globe and within countries, and seemingly at the moment that we're in a kind of a global upsurge again with racism. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers to you today. We have, as mentioned, Ambassador Nozipho January Bardul. She is the chairperson of the Council of the Nelson Mandela University and also attached to the United Nations Global Compact local network in South Africa. She's also the owner of Bardul and Associates, which is a consulting company that advises companies on diversity and inclusion. She was at the start of 2021 appointed to the Board of Trustees of the UN Voluntary Fund for Technical Assistance and the implementation of the Universal Periodic Report in the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. She's also served as an independent non-executive director on the boards of several companies, and she's on the board of 2 NGOs, Penduka and Swaranang. She's a trustee of the Nelson Mandela Children's Hospital and Fund. Ambassador January Bardul has also served, of course, as South Africa's ambassador to Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and the Holy See. And she was also interim chief of staff and special advisor to UN Women. And as mentioned, on the UN Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And I have to also added congratulations. I don't know how Ambassador January Bardul got the time for this, but we have to congratulate her for her just released book that she's edited and published, titled Right to Speak, which is a book with 55 stories written by African women leaders from across 23 nations. That has just come out. Then we have our Chancellor of Nelson Mandela University, Dr. Fraser Molokai. She is a very well-known figure, of course, here in South Africa. Her political career spans various formal roles in government and at political party level. She was a member of parliament for 3 consecutive parliaments. She has served in various deputy ministerial and ministerial positions. Also at the time of the conference, given her role then also at the conference. She concurrently served as chair of the Pan-African Ministers of Public Service for 3 consecutive terms, and she was also on the UN Committee of Experts in Public Administration and on the Commonwealth Association for Public Administration and Management Board. She was the global director of the UNDP's Democratic Governance Group and also joined the African Development Bank as Special Envoy on Gender. She has also been named the 2016 New African Woman of the Year by the London-based magazine New African. She's on various boards across academia and in the private sector, and also chairs the Advisory Council of the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection. Then we have Dr. Nyameko Bani Pityana with us today, born in Uitenhage on the 7th of August 1945. He's one of the founding members of the South African Students' Organization, a very important figure, of course, in the Black consciousness movement, an exponent of Black theology, a professor emeritus of law, and also the former principal and vice chancellor of the University of South Africa. Dr. Pityana went into exile in England, where he enrolled for further studies, having already received a law degree from UNISA at the time. He returned to South Africa in the early 1990s and was elected chair of the South African Human Rights Commission in 1995, and it was in that capacity that he then also participated as the spokesperson for national entities at the 2001 conference. In 2002, he was appointed as a Fellow of King's College London, and in the same year, he was also given an honourable mention in the UNESCO Prize for Human Rights Education. And then finally, and definitely not the least, Professor Shirley-Ann Tait, who is a professor and Canada Research Chair Tier 1 in Feminism and Intersectionality in the Sociology Department, University of Alberta, Canada. She's an honorary professor, also she's an honorary professor affiliated to the chair in critical studies in higher education transformation at Nelson Mandela University. And she's also a visiting professor at the University of Helsinki and Leeds Beckett University, Britain. Her area of research is Black diaspora studies broadly, and her research interests are institutional racism, the body, affect, beauty, hybridity, race performativity, and Caribbean decolonial studies, while paying attention to the intersections of race and gender. Her current research project is on anti-racism and decolonization in universities. And without further ado, let me hand over to Ambassador Jean-Marie Bardot, who will speak for 10 minutes. And yeah, thank you, Ambassador. Over to you.
Thank you, Professor Christie, for the very elaborate introduction and very warm one as well. And a good afternoon to all the people who are on this webinar. May I also take the opportunity to thank our university, Professor Mutwa and her DVCs and members of her team for organizing today, which for us has been quite significant. It felt at the university that we couldn't really let the 20th anniversary of the World Conference go unnoticed at the university, and so having this webinar this afternoon is really to place our own mark on the importance of racism, not only in our country and the world, but also in our institution, and how we ourselves as an organization need to go back and study the Platform for Action and see what it is in that Platform for Action that we can take to improve the state of race relations and racism in our province as well as in our university. And so my task this afternoon is really to say more about the World Conference Against Racism, which happened, as Christy said earlier on, at about the same time in 2001. Just to give it some context, I had just been elected to the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, called CERD for short, which was the committee that whose role is to oversee the implementation of the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination by parties who had ratified, by states parties who had ratified this convention. And so in its resolution 52111 of December 1997, the United Nations decided to convene the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerances. And the General Assembly at the General Assembly of the United Nations, and it was seen as its main objective of the World Conference on Racism in 2001 was to review the political, historical, cultural, and other factors leading to racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. So for all intents and purposes, this was a very important event in the history of international relations and in the efforts to address racism by countries across the globe. The United Nations chose Durban in 2001, and that was primarily because our new non-racial democracy had replaced decades of institutional racism under apartheid. The conference brought together governments, intergovernmental organizations, non-governmental organizations in civil society from all the 5 regions of the world. And like other world conferences, this was no different. They include dialogues between states, dialogues between states, communications between NGOs, many years before, in fact, the World Conference happened. In this case, we recall at least 2 or 3 years culminated in the event that was held in Durban. And I won't go into the details, simply to say that the engagement processes in preparation for a conference of this size had literally gone on for quite a number of years before the conference itself. So the goals of the conference were to agree upon a global repudiation of the evils of contemporary forms of racism, and also to define a comprehensive program of action to eradicate what is still considered as one of the most persistent and threatening problems confronting the world. What was significant for many of us who were involved in the many preparatory processes is that the program embarked on addressing the most difficult and painful aspects of the history of racism, including the transatlantic slave trade, colonialism, and the experiences of people of African descent in particular, and not only on our continent, but throughout the world. Contemporary forms of racism, such as hate speech on the internet and others, were also identified as mechanisms that perpetuate racism in the world. So several conferences were taking place at the same time in and around Durban at the time, besides the official United Nations Government Conference. There was an activity called the Voices Program that had created a platform for victims of racism from across the world to talk about their experiences of racism. These daily testimonies that went on for the duration of the conference and public hearings had never been done before. The NGO forum comprised of thousands of big and small NGOs from civil society organizations, and mainly young people. They had organized many workshops on the subject of racism, discrimination, and related intolerances. And because there was so much going on in and around Durban, many of those who were official conference delegates were hardly aware of what was happening around them. Their focus was on the plenary sessions where governments were debating and trying to grapple and seek solutions by consensus on some of the more controversial elements of the race reality. And as you all know, the United Nations operates on consensus politics. And so I think everybody understood that to bring something out of the conference, they would need to negotiate quite hard to make sure that their issues, their passions were not kicked off the list of issues that they wanted to raise. So in her article on the World Conference Against Racism, called Through a Wider Lens, my colleague on the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, Ms. Gay McDougall from the United States, who was also a member of CERD at the time that I joined in 2000, she makes quite some salient points, which I will share with you in my own attempts to try and give you a very objective kind of sense of what happened at this conference. The salient points that she makes really is to attempt to debunk the narrative that followed the American and Israeli walkout from the conference. What she effectively does is to adopt a more positive sentiment, a kind of, a glass half full rather than the glass empty lens to what happened in Durban. The first and often the more dominant narrative was that the main focus of the conference was the Israeli-Palestinian crisis. She admits that there was indeed an attempt by elements in the media to locate this issue at the center of the discourse and the debates that took place, especially against the background of a second and raging intifada that was taking place at the time. But Gail does explain that this had less to do with the effect of distorting the focus of the conference and misrepresented what had really happened. So she argues that the focus on Israel and America at the time in Durban was not exactly the entire story. The unfortunate events of the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the US further fueled the myth that it was the hatred expressed towards the Israeli at Durban that led to the 9/11 attacks in that fateful September day in 2001. Truth is, there was much more to the conference on racism than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that in fact enhanced the struggle for racial justice. What was accomplished in the McDougall sense was in many ways a lot of other things, and she includes that delegates grappled with the past in a very historic way that had never been done before. So the whole conversation, all the conversations around slavery had not been dealt with in such detail as was done at the conference. The conference was able to clarify the discourse that highlighted the true nature of racism and the mechanics of it as well. We experienced as well the contemporary issue relating to racial discrimination, which were highlighted in the conference. The principles of equality, non-discrimination, and the rule of law were reaffirmed and recommitted to. And the plan of action based on a common ground was also consolidated. Other more thorny issues needed more attention and dialogue and understanding. And civil society also created many global networks that were committing at the time to continuing the struggle against racism. There was also a context to empower victims groups that was created at this conference. Prior to that, world conferences, the victims of the issues that were being addressed were never seen or heard. So the transatlantic slave trade was talked about openly and truthfully for the first time in the history of the United Nations. I recall Jesse Jackson sought an apology from Western countries and others that wanted reparations. But knowing what was possible, some African governments thought that seeking reparations was perhaps too hot a potato while they were seeking development assistance. Many of the states pushed back very hard on any engagement with the past. The fact is that the final language in the Durban Declaration and Program of Action did move the racial debate further, despite its failure to satisfy fully all the contested issues. Governments did regret the suffering caused by slavery and apartheid and colonialism, and although a regret was not enough, it was still a small move. They also recognized that slavery was and remains a crime against humanity, including in modern times, and Western governments did indeed fear litigation and class action suits for reparations. So they did not reach consensus on some of these issues, but at the same time, to expect that they would have done would have been totally unrealistic. So I see Christy is giving me a message that my time is up. It is not possible to do justice to this conversation in 10 minutes, but needless to say that we have more chances of communicating. I'll conclude by saying that despite everything that happened at the World Conference and the fact that the Americans and Israelis walked out, there are a lot of positive issues that are assisting us in current and contemporary times to deal with some of the challenges that we face. Of course, the program of action also led to tougher anti-discrimination legislation in some of our countries, even though the implementation thereof is sometimes lacking. There is a lot more education on issues related to racism. There is an improvement in seeking remedies and recourses to victims of racism. And I think states parties also have agreed to ratify the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And so victims, people of African descent, indigenous peoples, people of the Dalit castes in India, and other minority groups did have their voices heard, and they were themselves seen during this conference. The difference between Zionism and the Israeli state, I think, is something that we all are more aware of perhaps than we were then. At the same time, you know, the conference did condemn some of the anti-Semitism that was also demonstrated at the conference. And by the time the conference ended, 37 out of 77 NGOs rejected the NGO final document for its hateful language and its anti-Semitic sentiment. Today, Black Lives Matter in the US, as was stated earlier, has taken on the baton, and young people are at the forefront of fighting for racial justice. And many of those who, prior to this conference, were invisible do have a voice as we speak today. So that's all I'll say for now, Christy, and hope that there'll be an opportunity for others to talk more about the contemporary aspects of this world challenge that is called racism.
Thank you so much to our ambassador, January Baldwin. I'm going to hand over to our Chancellor at Nelson Mandela University, Dr. Fraser.
Thank you very much, Professor van der Westhuizen. I would also like to join the Chair of Council by congratulating our Vice Chancellor and the University for convening this particular meeting. I mean, it's quite important for us to look back 20 years and to look forward as to what must be done. So I'm going to take us back into the room a little bit in 2020, but I'll start with the earlier room, having Professor Pajana with us on this particular panel. And remind you through quotes by President Thabo Mbeki, a quote that he made on the 30th of August 2000 when he addressed the National Conference on Racism that was convened amongst others by Prof. Pajana and the Human Rights Commission. And he said, and I think it's necessary for us to amplify this today, and I quote, "I would like to believe that there are some basic propositions on which we would all agree. And let me state some of these. First, the practice of racism is both anti-human and constitutes a gross violation of human rights. Second, as it has been practiced through the centuries, the Black people have been the victims of racism rather than the perpetrators. Accordingly, what we have to deal with is white anti-Black racism while giving no quarter to any tendency towards Black anti-white racism, whether actual or potential, as well as anti-Semitism. Third, racism is manifested in a variety of ways, these being the ideological, existing in the world of ideas, and the socio-economic, describing the social, political, economic, and cultural power relations of domination and discrimination against the victims of racism. Fourth, for many centuries, racism has been a fundamental defining feature of the relations between Black and white, a directive principle informing the structure of these relations. Fifth, the legacy of racism is so deeply entrenched that no country anywhere in the world has succeeded to create a non-racial society. Indeed, a deeply disturbing resurgence of racism and xenophobia constitutes part of the current social and political reality in some of the developed countries of the North. These countries pride themselves, perhaps justifiably, as the home and repository of the ideas and practice of human rights, democracy, equality, and human solidarity, and leaders whose example we should emulate. 6, global experience stretching over a long period of time demonstrates that the creation of a constitutional and legal framework for the suppression of racism is a necessary but not sufficient condition to end this violation of human rights. Accordingly, a constitutional and legally guaranteed right to equality and non-discrimination is very important in the fight against racism. Similarly, the legal possibility and right to redress in the case of such discrimination is also critical. At the same time, the creation of socio-economic conditions enabling such equality to be achieved is fundamental to the realization of the constitutional and legally guaranteed right to equality, close quotes. I wanted to take us back into that room first, because I believe as we reflect 20 years later, that we can agree that those realities are regrettably still in place, and firmly so. And we've seen that play itself out globally. However, I'd like to join both the Vice-Chancellor as well as the Chair of Council by stating that the World Conference Against Racism had opened this up to the world and South Africa to look at more closely. And I will reflect on this a little bit from the perspective of government. And on that, I will start out with the National Action Plan. And as stated earlier, the government of South Africa came up with a National Action Plan in 2019 to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. As was stated by many, that was considerably later than anticipated and also intended, but it has happened. So this national plan had been developed through a comprehensive process, consultation process, involving government, the Chapter 9 institutions, and civil society. It was informed by the general principles of universality, interdependence, and indivisibility of human rights, participation and inclusion, progressive realization, accountability, equality, and non-discrimination. The National Action Plan aims to achieve the following with regards to fighting racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. And that includes to promote human dignity through the promotion and protection of human rights, to raise awareness and engender commitment, to encourage data collection, to address the concerns of people affected, to increase effectiveness and coherence of measures implemented, to strengthen programs for individuals and groups encountering discrimination, and to facilitate identification of legislation that needs to be amended and or adopted to build a more equal society and strengthen the rule of law and democracy. The measures to implement the National Action Plan objectives are laid out in the policy document. And of course, the role of government is the promotion and protection of human rights and the prevention of human rights abuses. The 3 Ps from Section 7(2) of the Constitution. Now we know the initiatives under the National Action Plan has not been fully realized and are still in their infancy. And we are told this is due to resources available, but I think there's clearly a need to speed up this particular process going forward. I'd want to conclude with the following, because I'm nearly at the end of my 10-minute slot, to simply broadly state the position of the South African government in addition to the National Action Plan that I referred to. And this is the fact that they are looking at deepening constitutionalism, the point I had raised earlier out of the National Action Plan, the respect for the rule of law and the promotion and protection of human rights, Secondly, to look at combating of racism, hate crime, xenophobia, and other related intolerance, including the fight against gender-based violence and femicide. Thirdly, good governance, democracy, and service delivery. And then fourth, using the Constitution as a tool for addressing socio-economic challenges. It goes to the point that was raised 20 years back. And then, of course, the relationship between the three branches of the state, which is the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature, and building social cohesion and unity of our nation. We have, since 2016, seen instances of high-profile cases, and I will mention names because we don't have time to look at it. And here, the names of people like Penny Sparrow comes to mind in 2016, Vicky Momberg in 2018, and Adam Katsovelos in 2020. I think the rest we can talk about as we deal with it. Thank you very much, Professor van der Westhuizen, and to the rest of the panel.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fraser Moloketi. I'm extremely impressed with your timekeeping. You were actually a little bit ahead of me, so yeah, thank you for that. Let me hand over to Dr. Pityana. Thank you.
Christy, thank you very much, and thank you very much, my colleagues on the panel. Thank you very much to the Vice Chancellor, the Chancellor, and the Chairperson of Council, and the members of the executive team at Nelson Mandela University. This is a celebrated event. This is my first appearance as a visiting professor, or an honorary professor at Nelson Mandela University. So, celebrations. The United Nations World Conference Against Racism was, if you like, recognition that South Africa under Nelson Mandela, a constitutional democratic state, was a valuable member of the community of nations. An international conference of this magnitude clearly established South Africa's reputation as a leader among nations, especially on the matter as significant for our country as racism had been throughout the history of this nation. The World Conference brought together a large number of state delegates, civil society organizations, experts in the field of racism, and representatives of affected groups and nation groups, victims of various kinds of racial intolerance, and activists in all kinds of the struggles for social justice. Chaired by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, President Mary Robinson, the conference, meeting over 8 days, produced perhaps the most comprehensive statement on all aspects of race, an analysis of the prevalence of race, scientific theories on race determinism, its history in the construction of nation states, and how racism had affected various aspects of human endeavor. The strength of the declaration, I think, was in the all-encompassing and comprehensive treatment of the subject that does not always present itself alike in different places, with the result that inevitably it failed to accord enough specificity to struggles of different groups that were struggling to overcome. So at the end of the day, not everybody was satisfied with the outcomes. The declaration ended with a program of action that was meant to be as specific and ostensibly capable of being monitored and progress tracked for success and failures. I was at the time chairperson of the South African Human Rights Commission. With the assistance of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, we had established an organization of national human rights institutions worldwide, especially those that accorded with the Paris Principles, thereby entrenching both their independence, their governance, their adequate resources, and with the clarity of constitutional mandate. The national human rights institutions convened in Durban at the time, parallel to the conference itself. Likewise, several other parallel events were scheduled alongside the conference. This made Durban at the time abuzz with the world at war with racism. As chairperson of the South African Human Rights Commission, we had organized two significant events in 2000 and 2001 prior to the UN World Conference. The first was the hearing on racism in the media. It was a very controversial inquiry, much resisted by the mainstream media. This was held in August 2000. The report fault lines that came out of it found that South African media institutions maintained a style of operation, language, and insights drawn from the dominant cultures, rarely, if ever, questioned. Much work was done in the report in addressing the distinction between the Bill of Rights and attendance to the practices of violations of rights and the balancing thereof. It was also made clear that racism was more than aspirational, but it was also about the outcomes. The final report of the National Conference on Racism, Combating Racism, A Nation in Dialogue, the theoretical structure of the conference was to experiment with the idea of dialogue, enabling South Africans to be in existential conversations with one another, with a view to discovering and acknowledging, and ultimately to transform societal attitudes and set the scene for a universal enjoyment of all rights by all South Africans at all times, as entrenched in our Constitution. This suggests that beyond protestations about racism, it was vital that South Africans acknowledged that race was a factor in South African life today, and it affected the majority of South Africans negatively, and that solutions were to come from a common commitment by all South Africans. The conference adopted a final statement and a program of action. The World Conference, therefore, must have found South Africa rather creative and critical insights and fertile ground to bring about a renewed, a fresh, and understanding of racism in the world today. This would then have raised expectations by ordinary South Africans that racism indeed was being addressed. Looking back today, for 20 years on, one can say without any hesitation that while the World Conference achieved a lot in expectations, that the world community was at one in seeking and finding solutions to the nightmare of racism in the world, yet the world actually has not given effect to what it believed. It raised expectations. At the same time, at state level, by and large, expectations were dashed. Secondly, it is debatable whether too many countries managed to take the spirit of Durban to their own countries. The walkouts by the delegation of the United States and Israel, and the hesitancy, if not indifference, of the European Union demonstrate that the powerful nations of the world remain very defensive, if not in denial about their respective roles in the mapping out of racism. Thirdly, I have made the point that in the Durban Declaration, a comprehensive analytical statement on racism, xenophobia, and related intolerance will be hard to find anywhere else. Notwithstanding that, however, it is worth making the point that racism is a form of abuse of power, or a means of exclusion or marginalization of others from participation in the equal and getting an equal share of the resources and benefits of the world. While there may be very little of the crude forms of Hitlerite racism as in the Nazi or in the apartheid doctrine, the subtlety and the subliminal expressions and manifestations of racism were hard to overcome. Fourthly, ultimately, racism is known by its fruits, and not so much by the intentions of those who practice it, or indeed sometimes those who claim to be opposed to it. And so I want to come back to today as I conclude. In South Africa today, we can speak, I think, about the psychological effects of racism. By this, I mean that racism is not so much what the perpetrator of another color does, but rather that the persons of all colors have internalized racist subjectivity, such that if there are better resources materially or otherwise, they will act towards those, even if they are of the same color, as the superiority complex between black and white persists. One must then understand how it is that in our day and age in South Africa, some 30 years since the demise of apartheid, it is fair to charge that apartheid is alive and well. It is a living organism that continues to be nurtured and given oxygen by our policies of inequality and poverty, unemployment, and unequal treatment in the delivery of services, education, health, etc., that the poor, who tend to be overwhelmingly Black, experience at the hands of those who have power to oppress and subject others to inhumane treatment. How do we explain, for example, decades since the World Conference, how do we explain the Marikana massacre of August 2012, where Black police under a Black command would have mowed down with live firepower 34 workers who were doing no more than demanding better pay? How do we explain that in this day and age we continue to have virtual Black and white schools and universities with the attendant inequalities? Some have even raised the question as to how justifiable is it that race classification continues to be the normal practice in our population registry. I end by acknowledging that the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development, as we've heard, adopted a national action plan. However, in South Africa, we tend to be very adept at dealing with the pathology of race, and we're afraid to address honestly and deliberately the meaning of becoming an anti-racist society. We have to deal with the persistence of racism. That, I suggest, will require a fundamental dismantling and restructuring of the social and economic fabric of our society. Where do we start, and how do we start? Thank you, Christy.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. Some powerful questions posed for us there, and I do want to encourage people to please post your questions and comments in the chat. We already have a few questions and comments there. Appreciate it. Please post some more for us to grapple with as soon as our last speaker has addressed us. Professor Shirley-Ann Tait, welcome. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Christy. I want to also thank you for the invitation to be here. It's such a privilege for me to be in the room with people who were there at that very historic World Conference and who contributed to its deliberations. I want to thank you for all of your wonderful talks so far. I wanted to listen. I didn't want to contribute, actually. So, I'm going to start off by talking about me a little bit. So, don't worry, I'll get to the main part soon. I'm from the village of Sligoville in Jamaica, and this was the first free village after slavery ended in 1838. Like the majority of Jamaicans, I'm a descendant of enslaved Africans. As such, the UN Human Rights Council's 2021 report's call to seek reparatory justice for the legacies of enslavement really resonate with me. It leaves me with a lot of questions. For example, what is Black life worth? What about Africa's losses, not just to the transatlantic slave trade, but also to the Arabic slave trade, which number in the millions? What do we do about that? Also, what about knowledge reparations? I'm going to just tell you a little story about a country in the Caribbean called Haiti. I'm sure you've all heard about Haiti. Haiti was the first Black republic in the Western Hemisphere, and it was the first country to state in its constitution that all humans are socially equal and that slavery was abolished forever. But what did they get from the revolution that they had to engage in order to throw the colonial master France out? And what did they get for their declaration of the first Black Republic? They got reprisals. After about 21 years of independence, of being a sovereign state, in 1825, France and its allies, some other European countries and the United States, surrounded the country with gunboats. They blockaded the country as it celebrated its 21st anniversary of independence. the people of Haiti were forced to pay reparations to their former colonizers and slave owners or be invaded. The Haitians paid reparations because they were politically and economically isolated internationally. They agreed to pay 150 million gold francs as compensation for slave owners' loss of property. Property, for example, themselves, nearly 500,000 African people formerly enslaved, also animals, buildings, stocks and bonds, because, you know, enslaved people were counted in as property of the plantation in common with buildings, stocks and bonds and animals. It took Haiti 100 years to pay this in full. And what's interesting about Haiti and why I started from that is that, according to Hilary Beckles, this then became the model for other European acts of emancipation in the Caribbean. For example, the British paid £20 million in reparations to slave owners for the loss of their human property. In the British Caribbean, the former enslaved still had to work for a full 4 years in the apprenticeship period between 1834 and 1838. They had to give free labor, so they actually contributed 52% of the 20 million in reparations. Staying with the Caribbean still, discussions on the issue of reparations for native genocide and slavery were initiated at a CARICOM Heads of Government meeting in July 2013 in Trinidad and Tobago. But this call for reparations has been one, it's still ongoing, has been one that was going on for probably about 100 years, if not longer, before that historic conference. It was held, for example, by popular protests from Pan-Africanists and Rastafarians. The Caribbean Reparations Committee was founded at this 2013 CARICOM meeting because Caribbean countries continue to live with the legacy of enslavement and lack of reparations on independence. People just wanted to be free from basically colonizers, so a lot of governments didn't even think about reparations in the independent settlement. For example, Caribbean countries are now left with infrastructural decay, ill health, poor education outcomes. The head of the Caribbean Reparations Committee is our very renowned Sir Hilary Beckles. He's from Barbados. He's an eminent, if not the preeminent Caribbean historian, and also the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies. And for his work on reparations, we owe him a great deal. Since the end of the Civil War in the United States, Black Americans have sought reparations. And the Caribbean Committee, their work has revitalized the African American Reparations Commission, according to Hilary Beckles. In April 2021, in April this year, in fact, the House Judiciary Committee in the United States voted on H.R. 40, a bill to set up a federal commission looking at the legacy of slavery. We still hear nothing, or a very muted something from Germany, but we still hear nothing from the UK and the rest of the EU. For Hilary Beckles, reparative justice is about a removal of modernity to create something new in the 21st century, which goes beyond African experience to include other racisms and anti-Indigenous racism as well. For him, for Beckles, reparative justice is about making the world know what the victim knows. Western states, former colonizers, well, they did call themselves civilizers too, should not decide what reparatory justice should look like, because they look at settlement. And a good example of this is Germany's settlement in 2021 for the Namibian genocide of Hereros and Nama people between 1904 and 1908. Germany did not engage in consultation, negotiation. Germany promised as development aid 1.1 billion euros, that is 940 million pounds, or 134 billion US dollars. I say the numbers, I say the amount of money, because this is what Black life is worth now. Reparations should be a process not an event, not a settlement. That is what the Caribbean Reparations Committee would say. Reparation should involve, first of all, an apology, and then it should also be an admission to wrongs and also admission to the legacy that comes from those crimes against humanity. Then it should be about working in partnership on development. This is what the Caribbean Reparations Committee think that reparative justice should be about. So for them, we should ensure that beneficiaries of crimes against humanity do not continue to benefit. And we should also, in this instance, look at Germany's promised development aid also quite suspiciously, of course, because that is also about continuing to benefit. I've nearly finished. Reparative justice is needed, but we should, in terms of development, but we should not forget knowledge reparations. Knowledge reparations, for me, are part of that which is what is contained in the calls for decolonizing universities in the continent and the diaspora, and also Africanization in South Africa. We've seen Black studies in some institutions, but we've also seen something very interesting recently, just to show you the impact of knowledge reparations. We've seen Trump and Johnson do a fight back against some key aspects of Black thought in this part of the world, intersectionality and critical race theory or race studies, in what are called ongoing culture wars. That's it, Christy, thank you.
Thank you so much, Lily. Thank you so much to our speakers. I think you've given us a lot to work with and to think about. I think before we hand over to our audience for more questions and comments, and I do want to encourage our audience to please post some more comments and questions, which I will then pose to our panel members. Let me raise a few issues that have come up in the presentations so far, going back to what Ambassador January Bardol was talking about. And this is a theme that for me is sort of running through the presentations, and that's the whole question of remedies and recourse, and that came through right to the end, you know, in with the question of reparation, and the question being, you know, what should it look like? How should we be approaching this? I thought it was very useful what Professor Tate was quoting from the Caribbean Reparations Committee. You know, that the process aspect to it, that it's not only a question of writing out a check, that it's actually, it needs, because it's supposed to be a socially transformative process, one would want. In South Africa, of course, we've really also grappled with this, and not successfully, in the sense that our we have had a situation with white South Africans even withdrawing from the national discourse, and in a sense turning themselves away from really engaging with the legacy of apartheid, with the legacy of colonialism, and really stepping up and making sense of it together with other South Africans. So if I could return to Ambassador January Bardol, if you could share with us a little bit more around this question of remedies and recourse and the kind of shape that it should be taking. You also mentioned the question of the historical grappling with colonialism and slavery, you know, at the World Conference Against Racism, and in a sense how unprecedented that was, that there was actually quite a deep engagement with that, even for an international forum, which we know is limited in various ways. But yeah, speak a bit more to us about this question of remedies and recourse.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Christy. Let me start by saying that you know, when we deal with the United Nations context, and it's I always remind people that it's the only institution of its kind in the world. There really isn't another one like it, where member states are in fact governments, and that in itself contributes to kind of the limitations of what is possible. And secondly, the fact that the frameworks that we are often given at that level are related to legislation. So most of what is happening is looking at legislation because of the conventions that governments ratify. These are international pieces of law, and the law itself, you know, is, as Albie Sachs so aptly says about the law, that the law gives us recourse to complain. It is something where we can make a claim that something has happened to us, but the law itself does not necessarily transform society. So my response really is related to that issue. And thirdly, my experience of being a member of the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination is that because United Nations conventions are largely related to legislation and international law, the response to societal transformation is often seen in a very kind of technical way. So when we look at some of the solutions that have been offered, they are some of them are quite laudable on the one hand, but on the other hand, they are limited by the framework of legislation. And therefore you can pass laws, as we have done here in South Africa, where we have reversed all the laws, because that was also a recommendation, that governments look at the legislation and they transform their legislation to make their legislation more accessible to all people in their countries, especially those that are victims of racism or that are struggling to have a decent life because they don't have access to water, they don't have access to food, they don't have access to all the social issues that we mentioned earlier. So the reparations really are not a mystique at all. We ourselves know what needs to be done in our country here in South Africa, and I believe all other governments do know. The issue is the will. The issue is, are they willing to use the resources that they have from taxpayers' monies and others to actually make that difference? So more education, you know, how is our education system going to be able to talk about racism in the curriculum? What can school kids be, what can we do with children in our schools from a tiny age, from nursery school, you know, to unlearn racism rather than to learn it? What can families do in their homes to address the issue from a societal perspective? I often wonder about children in South Africa today. They go to school in the daytime and they have amazing interactions with their black peers, black and white kids. But at night when they go home, they're sitting around the dinner table talking perhaps to parents who are saying exactly the opposite of what they experienced at the school in the daytime. So what responsibilities do the broader society take in terms of this? You know, our criminal justice systems, lots of recommendations about how the police could be a little bit more effective in the way they handle cases of racism and sexual violence as well in our country, but also the judges. The judges have got, you know, they come with their own biases to preside over cases in the law courts, and to what extent are we working with them to make sure that some of those biases that they bring with them, because, you know, we are human beings, are not being, you know, are not compromising the justice issues that they are seeking to achieve. So across a whole spectrum of social, economic, cultural rights, I think there's evidence of that in the Platform for Action. But the big challenge, Christy, is the implementation and the will of governments to put resources, not only material resources, but also human resources. And for me, the bottom end of it is really the most basic one is education. Education and education. And the fact that, you know, as we're sitting in South Africa today, the irony is that we share a common history. We all know what happened during apartheid. It is our history that we share, but at the same time, it is a history that we don't want to talk about, even though we know about it. So I also think, you know, talking about it, like James Baldwin, I love reading James Baldwin because there's so much wisdom in what he writes about the States and how in America Americans are not wanting to deal with the issue of racism because it's maybe too painful for them. Maybe they don't want to face with the fact that racism also dehumanizes white people. You know, we are not the only, we are victims in terms of social economic rights, but in terms of human beings, it has taken something away, and to face that is such a difficult thing to do. So the World Conference, I think, was good in the sense that it brought others into the basket of oppressed peoples that up until then were not recognized, and the remedies are there. They are all in the platform for action.
Thank you. Yes, of course. The question of in a sense, there is, and it's I've written about it as well, and others have, around the dehumanization, you know, of the oppressor as well. You know, the process of dehumanization of white people as well. Now, I'd also like to hear what some of the other presenters have to say about that. I do want to confront you with Professor Mkize's question. And this is just this very significant question around the divergence between the African states and the Caribbean states at the conference at the time. And she's asking about whether the Africans were adopting a position of that in order for them to access support from the IMF and the World Bank, that they would need to, in a sense, rather side with the global north on this question. Or so therefore, whether it was a decision made with development in mind and development aid in mind, and in that sense, a kind of an economic kind of realpolitik that played itself out. I think just unmute yourself, please, Ambassador.
I think governments, all of them had some experience of working within the United Nations system and its consensus politics. And I think it was clear that the issue of reparations was a hot potato, because it still is. It remains a hot potato 20 years later, because it has implications for what resources, you know, as our Caribbean panel member said, that, you know, what are we worth? And can you actually put a rand value on the worth of people after so many years? So I think that there was a mixture of maybe governments that were very serious about reparations, but others who also made the strategic decision that, in fact, the conference would not get very far if they went too far with the reparations issue, because consensus-wise, it would not lead to anything. And in fact, it didn't. To a large extent. However, it was named. It was something that was brought forward and put on the table for discussion, and I think that's where its value lies. But the fact that they were going to agree on it, I think it's something that everybody understood was not going to happen at this conference. And Geraldine, you probably have a different view on that, but you were in government at the time, and you could perhaps share the discussions that we had on this. But my observation was that it was a deliberate decision not to go there, because in fact they were looking for development assistance at the time.
Yes, and I was about to call on our Chancellor to please share also your impression and your understanding of this divergence between the African and Caribbean states.
You know, I think to call it a divergence in this way would be a bit too stark, you know, because it also doesn't take into account the fact that we did have the Dakar conference as Africans, where we concluded that slavery is a crime against humanity. And there was quite a strong push from a number of African countries that it should be compensated. So that was an issue that was on the table. And I do want to say to Nomalanga Mkize that there was an agreement on that particular issue. However, as was explained by Ambassador Bardell, You know, this was the UN conference. We wanted to have an outcome document. It was around consensus building, but to present it simply as siding with would not be correct, because there were debates within the Africa group, just as there were debates between the African and Caribbean groups and their caucuses at the time, and quite a strong push in our engagement with the EU countries, as well as, well, it was essentially the EU countries, and at that point, Belgium's foreign minister was also the foreign minister for the EU at the time. An interesting country, we would all agree if we look at the reality of their role around colonization and slavery as well. So there were a number of debates. Did we come at did we have an outcome that was less suboptimal? Definitely. I mean, when I listen to the discussions here today as well, and how it's captured, I mean, definitely not what we would want. And we should also state up front that it is clear, and it's on record, that the US as well had looked and was very concerned around the language used related to, say, slavery and compensation in the draft documents. So there was a major contestation in the build-up to it. And hence, to the point that was raised by Shirley as well, it was, how do we deal with this particular issue? And how do we bring the reality of confronting the question of racism and slavery together with the whole issue of seeing a commitment that will provide a package that will take into account compensation? So I would not say, Shirley, as you have said, Nomalanga, as you have said, that Africans are saying that racism is no longer as important as is the broad question of our long-term development. We actually feel it should be indivisible, the two. We've got to confront racism, and this has been a common theme from all panelists. We've got to go into the depth of it. And I mean, I've actually thrown out the challenge around dealing with the realities of racism between white and black. We've heard we've heard Barney on the issue of what the challenges are at the moment and what has happened subsequently. So it's not been an easy question, but the World Conference Against Racism has actually given an opportunity and an impetus to bring certain things to the fore. Have we gone far enough as a world? No, we haven't, and we wouldn't be defending the indefensible. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fraser Moleketi. Also from my side, Ambassador January Bardol spoke about the limitations of the law. On the one hand, one needs the law in place. We need our constitution in place as a platform for certain one could say even processes of humanization to be able to begin. So you need that legal framework, that constitutional framework, but the law can only go that far. And you raised the question, Dr. Fraser Moleketi, about the various individuals, white individuals who have been prosecuted, and some criticism against that was that that it sort of is a kind of an individualization, which draws our attention away from the structural problem of racism, which I think Dr. Pityana was also hinting in the direction of. So if you would like to say a few more words about just the limitations of the law, how can we take it further? Should we probably prosecuting individuals? Is that a good approach? What more can be done?
Will you go first, Ambassador, and I'll follow up?
I think just unmute, please, Ambassador.
The individual prosecutions, look, I personally had kind of mixed feelings about them, not because I thought that it was okay to name call, because most of them had to do with kind of rather name calling. And yes, if the rule of law has to come into that, and in fact the legislation was being implemented by prosecuting them, then that was fine for me. But what disturbed me more was the fact that the platform of action actually has a whole section on the role of politicians and political parties. And I've seen politicians really also incite racism in ways that have taken advantage of, say, for example, some of the xenophobia that we have seen in our countries. So, you know, I'm more concerned about those kind of people than individuals who call names. I mean, I'm not wanting to take away the hurt of being name called from a victim, but at the same time, you know, I think, yeah, as I say, I would have been the way that the application of the rule of law is different. There's a differentiation, and to the extent that some are left untouched and others are taken to court is something that worries me considerably.
Thank you, Ambassador. Dr. Fraser Moleketi?
So I was names calling this afternoon, and I take full responsibility for that. And I do accept, and just in terms of the overall, my overall outlook is we must look at the structural change required. We also need to look at what the systemic interventions are, because if we look at racism, at the end of the day, it's systemic and it's structural, and this is global and national. However, as we deal with this, and as we look at what is overall national and global recourse, and I've spoken about the need to also build national and social cohesion. I agree with the issue of education and so on. But in instances, whilst being restorative in our approach, that means we've got to take a broader systemic approach. We also shouldn't allow individuals off the hook. So I look at a combination of the two. And we know that just in international history, whether you look at Nuremberg or you look, for example, at Rwanda, there is a combination of saying, how do we respond to the reality of deep discrimination and violations of the dignity of peoples in a more structural and systematic way, and that's where laws plays a role as well, whilst at the same time we also look at getting individuals to take responsibility within collective environments. So it's a matter of a combination. It's a very difficult balance, but I think it's a necessary balance, because if you look at South Africa, and as has been pointed out by Professor Pajana, as Professor Tate has also referred to the US, and if we look at the reality of Haiti and all, there are larger movements, there are global frameworks that we look at. But I think we also need to look at how we combine that with individual responsibility. So look in our instance, for example, at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the fact that we do still want to pursue individuals in such instances, much as we are aware that many of them were under instruction of what was the government of the day and so on. So I'm saying it's a combination. I think in short, that's where I come to, and I would not exclude politicians from anyone else, but I think we also need to ensure that we handle these issues in a combined.
Thank you so much. I want to bring our other two speakers in, Dr. Pityana and Professor Tait, just around this question of the historical grappling with colonialism and slavery. Dr. Pityana, you were talking about the importance of what you were calling existential conversations. And this also speaks to the question of dehumanization and particularly now white South Africans being willing to in a sense, put themselves out there to face the dehumanization that apartheid had wreaked on Black people's lives, but also the dehumanization that actually is involved in the oppression of other people. So, Dr. Pityana, if you want to come in and share a bit more with us around how you're thinking about these existential conversations and the form that they could take. And definitely not on social media, because we know we've got a very acerbic, well, not really a dialogue, as screaming sessions happening on social media that are not particularly helpful.
You know, I think what I was getting at, understanding racism, I want to start by saying, I think it is true that the extent of the analytical work that went into the Durban Declaration is unprecedented. The UN has never, I don't think, ever done anything like that. So in defining and explaining a very comprehensive understanding of racism that has gone into that, gives tools to those who are engaged in anti-racism struggles. And as much as it gives possibilities and capabilities to government and government policies, etc. So part of me says that that work was done, and it was actually very, very important. And the action plan is also equally important. But in the nature of United Nations events, it always talks at broad terms rather than in specifics all the time. So it was not surprising, for example, that those who went to that conference with a very clear mandate to secure, in this case, a statement on reparations, and didn't feel they got it, even though there was mention of the slave trade and the effect of that. And if you are a Dalit from India who had been silenced for so long, you would find that out of that statement there's a very strong positive statement in the face of strong opposition from the government of India. But it is there, it is important. So what I was saying then, in the light of that, what I was saying, Christy, is that it's important to recognize that the historic effects of racism ultimately depend on us who are here today to undo and to work. We use the power that we have. If we're a government, if we're a civil society organization in a democratic and constitutional state, it is often quite easy to stay as we are. I think in South Africa, in many respects, we've done that. We've tempered very little with what we found. We've just touched the periphery of the key issues and questions. But at the end of the day, it depends on people to transform themselves and their society. How do they do that? First of all, that aspect I think that Nozipo mentioned, they need to be honest and aware about what actually is happening in society and find the language. That's why in the national conference, we recognized that South Africans actually were not able to speak a language about racism without reiterating the apartheid terrible things that apartheid did. But actually that takes away it's only part of the story, but the important thing is, how do we find substance in our interpersonal relations, regardless at times of the color determinism that we were used to. So that is why the conversations are important, and we talked about dialogue at that particular conference, because South Africans actually don't have a language to deal with the phenomenon of race and of racism. In fact, actually, even today, we actually don't have a language to deal with race and racism here. So it seems to me, and I end on this point, it seems to me that the internalized race characterization that lives with us. If you are black, you are better than others, you've got more power, you're a councillor, you're a mayor, you're a politician, you're a president, you're a minister. It is not difficult for the Gogo Dlamini at the Sasa place to be put in her place by people who are supposed to serve that person, because actually internally we have internalized that level of disrespect for other black people, even though we ourselves are black. It is not difficult for the commander in Marikana to shower all of those people with bullets and have 34 people die, because actually you don't see yourself in the other people who are there and struggling. So the question of race understanding, and I mean, I talk about this all the time, that actually we are a long way to go with racism. We talk in general terms about race, we talk about black and white and all that, but actually all of us, especially black people, are victims of racism in a way that gets us to actually treat other black people as if they are nobodies. Thank you.
Yeah, those are very powerful words, and yeah, leads us back to that whole problem of understanding Marikana in the democratic era, which I don't think we've actually managed to do enough of that in our public discourse. So this question of the internalization of hierarchies, and also dehumanization of people on the basis of blackness. And I want to also ask Professor Tye to please come in on this question. How does one make sense of you're a regular visitor to South Africa. I think you've got a very good sense of the difficulties that we are grappling with here. How does one make sense of a Marikana in the democratic era? I'm sure there must be examples elsewhere in the world as well. Yeah, so we start with that, and I've got a few other questions for you as well. Thanks.
Yeah. I wouldn't like to speak too much about Marikana because I don't think I'm such an expert as you give me credit for, but thank you for introducing me to that way of thinking about dehumanization, how it is that Black people can be so dehumanized as humans that they dehumanize others and see them as things, as objects that can be killed without any, without any kind of possibility of their lives being saved. I would kind of put that down to colonialism, of course, and continuing white rule. I think my colleague before, all my colleagues have talked about white rule of the psyche. That's very much there, I would say, in South Africa, just like it is in any other colonized space in the world, and certainly in Europe. It's very much there in how we relate to each other as Black people. But I think it's also there in terms of how we relate to people who are not from our perceived group, say. And I want to go back again to what Hilary Beckles said about reparative justice, when he said it was about a removal of modernity to create something new in the 21st century, which goes beyond African experience. to include other racisms and anti-Indigenous racism. And the reason why I'm coming to this is because I think that in the part of the world that I know the best, this part that I'm sitting in now, there is continuing kind of liberal discourse on democratic values and equity, diversity, and inclusion. And now they've added decolonization without actually, knowing what that means. They didn't know what the rest meant either. But anyway, if we look at, for example, the continuing dispossession and killings and racism against Indigenous people in the Americas and the rest of the world too, we see that what we have is we have paper constructs. So we have constitutions which might say everyone is equal, right? But then we have the lived experience, which is always one of dehumanization, lack of value in terms of human life, and thinking about the human, which, as Sylvia Winter reminds us, still relates to the human, which is seen as the white man European of colonial times. So, of course, in Brazil, we have massive losses of Indigenous communities, individuals, and also continuing loss of land and sacred places. In Australia, we continue to see Indigenous dispossession there. In Canada, we have the unmarked graves of children from what were called residential schools, euphemistically called residential schools, being recovered by Indigenous communities, and great sorrow, of course, around that. But what we never get from former colonial powers, like the UK, for example, is anything of an apology. The UK was one of the colonizers, of course, in Canada. Christian churches set up those residential schools for assimilation, but also continuing genocide of Indigenous people, physically and culturally as well, and educationally. So for me, I think dehumanization, what we do to others, what we do to other people, continues to kind of mitigate against the possibility of having any kind of reparatory justice, I would say. And, so of course, when we get to Marikana, as my colleague said before, it makes total sense that they would open fire against, unarmed workers. Similarly, in Jamaica, it makes total sense that the police would do the same thing against people who they see as poor, criminal, coming from poor neighborhoods. Similarly, in the United States, we see George Floyd as one example, one instantiation of that. And in the UK too, and the rest of Europe. And I mean, what continues to amaze me, though, is the continual kind of fight back of white supremacy in our part of the world, a continuing fight back where there might be a gain made, maybe, like as Black people in the UK, we are let into some institutions to some level, but then there's a fight back against it. White supremacy, again, exerts itself to try and get back the ground it thinks it's lost. And we see that this, as I said before, in terms of the lack of knowledge reparations, where Black thought is still placed outside of many academic institutions. I'm going to stop because I rambled too much. And I didn't look at your question, Christy.
No, that's I wouldn't call it rambling at all. It's quite the opposite. Yeah, thank you for that. I was just struck by what you were saying earlier about the reparations question and how Haiti and other countries and groups of people and so forth had to get involved in reparations for slave owners. Mm-hmm. And it's just absolutely astonishing and also deeply troubling to think that kind of thing can be forced through, in the global order, where, because it's obviously that's backed up by your countries in the global north, your former colonial masters and so forth, that sort of demand those kinds of compensations. But then, and then when you come to the World Conference Against Racism, the opposite, or the completely overdue compensation for the actual criminality of the slave trade and so forth can be blocked to the extent that it has been done. So, is this are we talking just a question of a global kind of imbalance in power that just makes it impossible for states to push this through at this, still at this juncture, or how does one make sense of this?
Well, I find what's been happening since George Floyd's death very interesting, because we suddenly see former colonizers who enrich themselves and develop their economies and their whole societies from, black labor, suddenly saying things like, not the government so much, maybe there is something that we should say. So that, like, Barclays Bank have made an apology, for example, Lloyd's Bank have made an apology, Glasgow University has made an apology after much work with Hilary Beckles on what they could do in terms of reparations. The National Trust is looking at its buildings, so there's this kind of groundswell happening of individual institutions. They want to do something. At the level of government, nothing. What we get at the level, as you can expect, what we get at the level of government is complete blocking, not even to acknowledge that it's something that needs to be dealt with in the 21st century. What we hear continually from the UK government is basically, the usual English stuff of it's in the past and best forgotten. That was our ancestors, maybe not even our ancestors, it's got nothing to do with us, so we don't need to talk about that now. So that is basically kind of how it's dealt with. I guess if there turned out to be like loads of oil in the Caribbean, apart from in Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago, or something else that they wanted, it might change, but there's nothing that they want there anymore, including they don't want any Caribbean people in their countries, really, so no. It's a pity.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Tait. We have run out of time, I'm afraid. Ambassador, if you want to make a final before we hand over to Professor Keert.
Yes, thank you, Christy. I just wanted to make a very small point as well to say, the reparations issue is its more contemporary form is also about how we are not able to say, why are we struggling with manufacturing in our countries? Why can't we turn things into gold? Why can't we take the gold that we have of platinum and make a catalytic converters with our platinum? Why do all our chocolates, our cocoa from Ghana, go to Switzerland to make Lindt chocolates? So there's a sort of continuation of the status quo which impoverishes us. We can't even beneficiate the things that are natural assets, in our countries because of either the know-how or the fact that these trade relations that are also embedded in our United Nations systems and global political systems leave us, having to import most of the things that we use on a daily basis. So I'm just thinking about it's not just about reparative justice happening at the level that we've been discussing. It's also about these daily things that we struggle about, and I don't, where we can't manufacture our own car. Why can't we make our own cell phone in this country? Everybody uses a cell phone, but we don't make it. We don't make them here. And so, I'm sitting in that context of the university, and also to say to the students, the future that we are in means that they really have to start thinking about this from a sort of intellectual co-creation of a new reality, where we take some of that back and we use the knowledge that we have, the very things that we use every day, to make them ourselves, for ourselves. That was my last comment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ambassador, for that. And Yeah, thank you to our presenters. Just from my side, I must say, when I heard that the Belgian foreign minister was the lead person on the EU delegation, and of course Belgium with the history of King Leopold, and probably one of the most brutal colonial occupations on the African continent, I have to say, and when one visits Brussels, very, very little reflection happening there, if any at all. So, but yeah, thank you just from my side, and let me hand over to Professor Andre Keert, who's our Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Engagement and Transformation, and also holds the chair in Critical Studies in Higher Education Transformation.
And I was also at the World Conference Against Racism, just to remind people, okay, and the national one and the Dakar one as well. Just as an aside, this has been a great feast, colleagues, Chancellor, Vice Chancellor, Chair of Council, Prof. Pichana and Tate and Van der Vestage, and of course the BNC. So I think that the idea that is here that the panelists agree about the historical importance of the World Conference in 2001. I do think both in terms of as an event, but also in terms of its analytical positionings that it has taken on so many fronts. And it is true, a revisitation of that declaration makes for absolutely fantastic reading when it comes to the different sets of formulations about the struggles that we are engaged with. And it followed, of course, the South African National Conference as well. So Prof. Mutwa asked the question, that it's actually very difficult to fathom that why so little has changed on the structural and cultural level. And of course, the easy answer would be, the hold that the colonial modern imaginary has that root these processes structurally, it's difficult to unmoor them. She connects then global racism with gender-based violence within a national context, and of course referred to conservatization of politics across the globe. The ambassador, of course, from a third perspective, had the idea of how the major focus area was the global repudiation of racism, but also a very practicable program of action that merged through that. But I think beautifully sophisticated take on the USA-Israel walkout that I think one can take further into different sets of discussion. The historic elements of the conference came also through very strongly, the debate on slavery, transatlantic slavery, racism, and the question of reparations, the different sets of groupings at the conference, national and of course internationally. Our Chancellor, Dr. Fraser Moleketi, of course, within the engine room of WACAR, for us on the fringes, sometimes, preferred the NGO side of things, we sometimes can run away, of course, from the difficult discussions that state, delegates have to go through to deal with some of these matters and the negotiations between states, but against the backdrop of the contemporary resurgence of racism and xenophobia. And it is true that if one take a broader, glance at the globe, the challenges of that time are more or less a mirror image of what we are experiencing today, okay? But WACAR did open the question of in a kind of an awareness of the way in which the project of colonialism and the project of apartheid and the project of racism are so intertwined with the project of development, within the North. And as you can see, some of those analyses are now firmly on the table, with even clearer dexterity, of course. So Prof. Pichana is correct that there was a form of analytical acumen at play and an energy that was invested into the conference and the declaration and the program of action, of course. And for those who had to stay up the nights, the 2, 3, 4, 5 hours sleep patterns that one has to adapted to get some of these in place, but also the reference to the earlier work of the Human Rights Commission. So there was an energy, there was not only an analytical energy and an energy of intelligence at play, but there was also an energy of programmatic action that needed to come through as well. And the idea that South Africa as an experimental space to start tackling racism. And of course, Christy, you would know, and this is also for us at the university, it is quite sad that we don't have a world-renowned center for the study of racism in South Africa. Right? Just as the idea of South Africa not having that particular center is, I think, a blight on our name as a country and as a university sector. There we have dropped the ball big time, I suspect. And so that belief, that was present in 2001 that couldn't be converted into particular kinds of actions, then moved, of course, surely into the question of enslavement and reparations, and some great work that you bring into play there, Shirley, which is also a key theme of the World Conference, as you would know. And of course, the idea that the colonizers should not decide what reparations should look like and that it should be a process. And of course, that's the big debate that we have around the question of how do you tie in the discourse of reparations into the discourse of development. And then the imperative of knowledge reparations as a mode of decolonizing praxis. And of course, that discussion was then taken straight into the broader question and answer session that Christy led so well, tied in the notion of white supremacy, but also our own struggles for solidarities across regions, our difficulty even for self-solidarities, for solidarities within ourselves and amongst ourselves, of course, which is also tagged in to the project, of the colonial imaginary in the way in which, Black people have been dehumanized. And then, of course, solidarities across different sets of divides, intra and, of course, also internationally speaking as well. So what came through then, finally, from my side, is that the post-Walker inertia made possible in so many big ways, that particular inertia, the fact that we couldn't take the next step in a big way, I think that made possible, the insanity of massive global inequalities that we are experiencing today, and the conservatization of politics, not only in the global north, but now also in the global south. The rise of tragically powerful new waves of intra and interstate racism, race populism, bigotry, everyday fascisms, religious conservatisms, and ethno-nationalisms across the world. So there, of course, that's a particular misstep that has happened there, and of course now we will have to reset and take that further. And I think that's the question that Barney raised, the power of social agency, and what is it that we do today, and our duty and capacity actually to develop a language and praxis to deal with race and racism. And we have some great young colleagues, a new generation coming through, that we will have to work with, in tackling this matter. So to Prof. Mutwa, great, insightful, instructive, welcoming remarks. Many thanks to the panelists, discussants, and moderators. Ambassador January Badil, Dr. Fraser Moloketi, Profs Barney Pityana, and Prof. Shelley and Tate, and Prof. Christy van der Westhuizen of Kenrad. This was absolutely wonderful. Our partners, Kenrad, under the leadership of Alan Zinn, the Portfolio Engagement and Transformation, and the Research Chair in Critical Higher Education Studies Transformation. Then Ponzo Mabena, Dr. Thomas Hilmer, Dr. Agimbadi, Angus Brenkis, and Lizeko Nkosi for technical, social media, and admin support. To all of you, and of course to our attendees and participants, many thanks, okay, from a very grateful Nelson Mandela University outfit, and much thanks for joining us, okay? So please have a great rest of the afternoon. Thanks, colleagues.